Welcome to Biztech's Property Show, the show where we look at property markets regionally and globally to give you insights to help you better manage your existing properties, get better returns, and also help you make better decisions about your future purchases. Our focus today is the booming Australian property market. Now, to help to break down the details and insights, our guest today is Jason Dasey, ABC presenter, and now new member of the Biztech presenting team. Welcome to the show, Jason.
Good to see you again, Brian. It's great to be part of the Biztech Asia team.
Now, Jason, before we start, let's take a dive before we go into the nitty-gritties of the Australian property market, what does the macro picture look like?
Oh, it's very solid at the moment, Brian. Australia's recovery from coronavirus is one of the best in the world, as many people across Asia will know. And Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer of Australia, is very happy with the way things are going. He's preparing a budget for the next financial year, which will begin after June 30th on July the 1st. But the Australian unemployment rate is now down to 5.8%, which considering what we've gone through over the past 12 months is very good. So people are working, maybe not working as much as they'd like to, but the economy is ticking along, and it's pretty good predictions on all fronts when it comes to Australia's economy.
Now, Jason, the employment picture is somewhat skewed by the job seeker and job keeper schemes, which have been extended. Am I correct? The original stimulus, 100 billion, and that expired in the 31st of March, but that's been extended now with the second stimulus and an extension of these job programs, haven't they?
It's only partially been extended, Brian. The job keeper program has now stopped, but job seeker has continued, so people are able to get more money in their unemployment benefits. But even with the taking away of JobKeeper, we are seeing Australian businesses ticking along quite nicely. And Josh Frydenberg has warned that there won't be any real kind of austerity measures for the Australian economy for a while until we see that unemployment rate, which is currently at 5.8%, under 5%. And as you know, Brian, having lived in Australia, and a lot of our audience would know that to get under 5% in Australia for the unemployment rate would be something of a landmark. But that's the target before we see any real austerity measures when it comes to all the money that the federal government spent over the past 15 months or so.
Now, also, I think, and relating back to my economics degree of 30 years ago, I think 5% is below Australia's full employment rate of unemployment. So you will see actually expansionary threats to the system if you get to that 5% level.
Indeed, it would be a real landmark. In fact, Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer, has targeted 4.5%. That's how confident he is with the way things are going. But we must put this into perspective, because even though the unemployment rate is quite low compared to many other comparable countries around the world, people aren't working as much as they'd like. So there's a lot of underemployment. There's a lot of casual workers. You know, when I used to live in Australia 25 years ago, before living in Asia, there wasn't as many casual workers as there are now. Something like a third of all workers are now casual, which means they don't get a lot of the benefits that full-time employees get. So it's kind of a good picture, but there are ways, of course, that it can be improved.
But because of this really positive employment picture, and also on a macro side, the Reserve Bank of Australia has kept rates at these record low rates. So basically it's cheap to borrow money. The current account surplus continues, although the numbers are not as promising as they once were. So the overall macro picture for Australia is very, very good. That's obviously trickled down to this booming property market right now. But what's driving this frenzy of property buying in Australia?
Well, there are a few factors here, Brian. One of them, of course, as you mentioned, the rate is 0.1%. It's been kept there by the Reserve Bank of Australia, which means mortgage rates are also very low. So it's very cheap to get quite a lot of money. The other thing is that a lot of Australians have returned abroad from living overseas. I mean, like myself, I was an expat in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. I came back about 18 months ago. But in the last 12 months, we've seen a huge influx of Australians coming back home to Australia because of the way the country has dealt with the coronavirus pandemic. And all these Aussies need somewhere to live. And a lot of
Okay,
them got,
and you're an example of that. You've bought a house and you've bought another house.
well, yeah, I mean, we actually had bought a place. I'll give you my own story. We bought a place when I was living in Singapore about 4 years ago, a townhouse, sight unseen. And we've recently upgraded to buy another house. We're selling the one that I'm in at the moment, the townhouse. But we've actually looked at the numbers and said, look, we can move from a townhouse into a much bigger house. And because money is so cheap, our repayments are going to be roughly the same. And yet we have a much bigger stake in the market here. And if everyone knows that a house is a better investment than a home unit, apartment, or a townhouse. So that's the kind of stimulus that we are seeing to the property market at the moment. That's my personal story. And there are lots of other people in the same boat as me who've come back, who have decided to maybe, try and get into a bigger house because money's cheap.
And also the fuel that's fueling the fire is local demand. It's not foreign demand. Am I correct? It's basically
Yes.
local Australian demand.
Very much so. I've got a friend, actually, he works for Coloshay on the Gold Coast. It's a big real estate agent down on the Gold Coast in Queensland. And he used to get the bulk of his business offshore, from Southeast Asia, from China. But since the pandemic began, that's just about dried up. But he is getting a lot of people from the southern states of Victoria, from New South Wales, even from South Australia, deciding that they want to move to the Gold Coast. They've reassessed their life. They've gone through a tough pandemic. And even before the borders reopened, they were buying places sight unseen, whether a luxury apartment, houses in the Gold Coast, whether it's Service Paradise, Broadbeach, or wherever.
Jason, there is a real phenomena now of people moving away from population centers, densely populated centers, to less populated centers. So from London, for example, many people are selling their studio flats in London and moving away to the country and living in a nice country cottage with lots of space. And the work from home phenomena has really been a driver for this. Now, it's not only in London, there are other big metropolitan cities as well. The likes of New York, for example, there is a boom in property prices in the Hamptons because people are deciding that instead of it just being a holiday destination, they're moving there permanently.
Yeah, the same in Australia too, Brian. It was something that we saw more in North America, UK, and Europe, as you pointed out. But now, because the infrastructure in Australia is getting a lot better when it comes to the national broadband network or with the transportation services. So this year in Australia, we've seen an 18% rise in regional real estate. That means, whether it's regional Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and these centers that have been neglected for years are suddenly getting boosted by the influx of people now having the capacity to work from home. And this is really a good thing for these smaller towns. I mean, you've lived in Australia, as we mentioned, and you know that the bulk of the population lives on the coasts. But
yes,
there is a feeling now that we're going to see more people move to these inland centers to live, even if it might only be a couple of hours from where their family and friends are in the likes of Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, and Brisbane.
and that's a good thing also. I think overall, in terms of affordability, that's going to help, especially affordability is a problem in the Australian property market for relative to incomes. That's going to be a big stress relief for a lot of families.
For sure, Brian. I mean, when we look at the numbers, in April, the Australian property market increased 1.8%, and that followed a 2.8% increase in March. This is monthly, month to month. And 2.8% was the largest increase in 32 years. And Australia, in Sydney, where I'm from, my hometown, property prices have gone up more than $100,000 in the first part of this year, with the median price, well over $900,000. I think $950,457 for the median price in Sydney. It's simply not affordable. I've got a friend, he's a 30-year-old guy. He works at a TV station. He's in Sydney, SBS, and he's decided he can't afford Sydney real estate. So he's moved to the Blue Mountains, which is an hour-and-a-half drive. So every day he drives from the Blue Mountains to his office in Artarmon on Sydney's lower North Shore because he can't afford the real estate in Sydney. And There are so many stories like that across the big cities of Australia.
But is that and this has been already a problem prior to the pandemic, the affordability relative to incomes. There's a lot of thought that perhaps that bubble may burst moving forward, but I think it's really at anyone's guess at the moment, how this is going to play out.
Look, I mean, I'm looking at the numbers at every capital city, over the past month in April, it was Melbourne 1.3, Perth was below 1%, 0.8, Brisbane 1.7, Adelaide 2.0. These are monthly increases in real estate. And back in 2014, people were saying, oh, we've definitely hit the peak now. It's a bubble. Things are going to really go down. Throughout the pandemic, there were all these predictions that the real estate market could drop by 30%. But it's been the opposite. We've seen the prices rise when we knew there was going to be a vaccine, when we saw that the Australian economy had rebounded a lot better than many other economies, and all the Australians coming back to live here, which is a great country to be in. It's had this effect on the property prices. But there are certain vulnerabilities, of course, as well. But overall, the picture is very rosy.
Okay, let's talk about the vulnerabilities and the pockets and oversupply of stress. Where is that happening now? I understand that it's particularly in the high-rise markets in key cities like Melbourne.
Yes, very, very true. I actually do some work with RMIT, which is a university in Melbourne. And as many of the viewers know, I mean, Melbourne, Sydney are the two biggest university cities in Australia. And these inner city apartments, that's where we are seeing the weakness in the market, because there isn't the demand anymore, because so many overseas students, this is one of Australia's biggest industries, the international students, and so many of them are still offshore. They can't come back. And that means that there are a lot of vacancies, both with the rental market and also the demand for inner city apartments, whether it's in one of the big cities or perhaps even in a smaller city. There's just not the university traffic that we've seen in previous years. And there's a lot of debate about the way to solve this. And the Victorian state government came up with a plan last week to maybe do what they did in the Australian Open tennis, where they kind of created a different channel for returning international students. So they wouldn't have to go through the hotel quarantine system that any returning Australian or permanent resident has to go through. They might create a different pathway in the hope of getting this $10 billion industry back on its feet.
Yeah, because one of the things, and speaking about that industry itself, students have traditionally always been a large chunk of rental markets in major cities. But one of the things that, Jason, I want to ask you about is the oversupply of these high rises, because essentially there has been a big influx of overseas developers from China, from Malaysia, who have built these sky-rise, high-rise properties in the middle of the inner cities. And right now, there just isn't any demand for it.
Very true. We did see that kind of frenzy, didn't we, of building inner city apartments in Melbourne, in Sydney, and to a lesser extent here in Brisbane. But we haven't seen the demand that we were expecting. And a lot of people gambled on that. And some of the construction, to be quite honest, Brian, wasn't of the best quality. We had some issues in the Mascot area of Sydney, near the airport there, where there was all sorts of structural problems. So this is an area that many people are a bit concerned about. And of course, the pandemic has just heightened these concerns.
Now, Jason, foreign buyers basically are kind of out of the equation at the moment. Do you think that that's going to be then extra fuel to the fire the moment that there's some sort of travel ban that's lifted out of Australia?
I think there's a very good chance that this could be another stimulus to Australia's booming real estate market. Considering what we've seen, with up to 10% and more rises already this year in the average or median price of properties, in our major cities. And this is all without that overseas investment. I mean, just walking around the Gold Coast, I was there the other day, you're not seeing the tourists anymore. You're not seeing the international people there. It's a very Australian experience. But whenever these, whenever the borders reopen, whether it's 2022 or 2023, surely this is going to have a very big impact on the way our property market is exploding. You know, I've got friends in Hong Kong. My wife's from Hong Kong, and they want to get to Australia. It's difficult for them to come down here, but if they could, they would come down here. And a lot of people, you know, relatives of people who are permanent residents and family members, surely once the pandemic's over, we're going to see a huge influx of people coming down here and wanting to spend money, whether it's in tourism, whether it's in real estate, hospitality, you name it. So considering all that, considering all that we're missing in terms of our economy, it's a miracle that Australia's economy is doing so well. And real estate is a big part of that.
Well, the thing is, you know, that's why they call Australia the lucky country.
Lucky country, Brian, but we're quite unlucky with China at the moment because of you know, the various products that we're no longer exporting to China because of the bad relations, and that's a concern when it comes to our exports and our balance sheet.
Yeah, but the thing is, I think Australia, like especially with the wine exports, you have found different channels to export your markets. For example, to make up for the loss of the China market. For example, in the wine industry, Australia's exports to the UK are up by 1/3, 30%, because basically they've diverted all the previously Chinese exports over to the UK, a traditional export market that they are then pushing. I think the US market is also up about 10%.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of opportunities potentially with the UK. There have been some trade missions between Australia and the UK. And Boris Johnson, you know, very colourful character, the British Prime Minister, he had a packet of Tim Tams. And I know, Brian, from your days studying in Australia, you know what Tim Tams are. These are the chocolate biscuits. And he was talking how great the Tim Tams were. So there are other trade opportunities for Australia, despite our challenges with China, which has really dented the confidence of a lot of our farmers. You know, they're having to find different markets. But certainly the UK, with its different challenges and different perspectives, that's somewhere that we can look towards, you know, into 2021 and 2022.
Now, Jason, final question. Where do you see the opportunities for an overseas buyer who perhaps sees what's happening in Australia and wants to get in on the action before all the other foreigners do? Because in Singapore, for example, lots of foreign buyers are buying properties sight unseen.
I think that Brisbane is still a great value city. And I'll give you an example. You know, as I mentioned, we are moving house. We're moving house to a 4-bedroom house, which is about 5 kilometers from the center of Brisbane. And that house in Sydney would be at least 3 times more. And in Melbourne would be at least 2 times more. So Southeast Queensland has seen a massive influx of people from southern states in the past year or so. And within the 10-kilometer radius of the center of Brisbane, you can still buy a 4-bedroom house for less than $1 million Australian dollars, which would be around 770,000 US dollars, which is incredible value when you consider, you know, my mum, she lives around 5 kilometers from the CBD in Sydney. She lives in an old house that was built in the 1920s. Because of the land value and the view of the harbour, that house is probably worth $3 million. The same house, if it was here in Brisbane, in the same location, might be worth $500,000. We're talking Australian dollars here. So that gives you the idea and the perspective that Brisbane still offers very, very good value for overseas investors. And we are seeing over the last couple of years, a lot of people from Hong Kong, from Singapore, Malaysia, and other places trying to get out here to the smaller, the second-tier cities of Australia, whether it's Adelaide, whether it's Brisbane or Perth, because they offer much better value than the Sydney and Melbourne's. But you've got to have a different mindset, Brian, if you are in a Brisbane, because the pace of life here is a lot slower, the sun's shining, and maybe it's not as, you know, there's not the pulsating rhythm of a Sydney or a Melbourne.
Well, for some people, that's exactly what they're looking for. Jason, thank you very much for taking your time to share your views on the Australian property market.
Thank you, Brian. It's been a pleasure.
Now, we've been speaking to Jason Dasey on Biztech's Property Show. I'm Brian Fernandez. Check out www.biztech.asia. for business and technology conversations. Please subscribe and like our LinkedIn and Facebook pages. Thank you very much for watching.